Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. Clone troopers. They became before Stormtroopers, yet a lot of military historians and experts view the creation of the Stormtrooper Corps as a step backwards for the Empire. Brendel Huck's a Clone Wars veteran and the architect for the First Order Stormtrooper program, served with both clone troopers and stormtroopers, and concluded that the former was far superior in most combat situations. So my question today is, why were the clone troopers replaced? What made them such a large liability that Palpatine had the entire Grand Army of the Republic overhauled and replaced the clone troopers with stormtroopers? In Legends, there were several clone uprisings following Order 66 and the rise of the New Order. One of the major rebellions was conducted by the Kamino Clone Masters. Towards the end of the war, Chancellor Palpatine took drastic steps to ensure the safety of Kamino. A favorite tactic of the Sith Lord was to expose the vulnerability of an important national or military asset and use that as an excuse to nationalize it and put it under the protection of the Grand Army of the Republic. He used this very same tactic to get control of the banking clans.
In hope of a better tomorrow, we cede control of the banks to the office of the Chancellor of the Galactic Republic.
The Kaminoans were a very secretive race of aliens and generally had an elitist attitude towards the rest of the galaxy. They had survived an extinction level event after their planet had flooded by brutally culling their own population. They did this by weeding out the genetically weak and undesirable first. Thought of the Republic or the Empire coming in and taking over really pissed them off. The Kaminoans foolishly thought that they could take on the might of the Empire and created rogue clone soldiers to protect their world.
A special detachment of the Imperial 501st Legion was dispatched to Kamino with orders to eradicate an army of clones that had been bred to take arms against the Empire.
In the end, the Kaminoans were easily defeated, but this incident did make Emperor Palpatine reconsider using the clones in his army. The uprising of the clones on Kamino showed the Emperor that clones were easy to manipulate. Palpatine realized their willingness to follow orders and not to question their superiors made it very easy for disgruntled officers or leaders to stage a coup or rebellion by tricking their clones into following them. While these clones were efficient killing machines, they were technically only 10 years old and quite naive and willing to follow people blindly. The very thing that made Order 66 and the Jedi Purge possible also meant that they could be turned against their master in the same way. Eventually, the Empire began placing clones in non-combat duties until they were eventually phased out and replaced by human soldiers. While the Fett clones were arguably perfect genetic specimens, especially when it came to soldiering, having them all share the same DNA meant they lacked genetic diversity, which meant they all had the same genetic weakness. Of course, the Kaminoan cloners assured their clients that there were no such genetic weaknesses in their clones, but I usually don't trust talking fishes. Hashtag humanity first. And even if the clones didn't have some genetic weakness that could potentially devastate the entire army, they still shared DNA, which made them vulnerable to targeted bioweapons that could be designed specifically to kill or maim their bodies, but at the same time be harmless to other humans and living beings. It's part of the reason why in Legends the Empire played around with using several different individuals as templates for cloning instead of having them all come from Fett. Another thing that made the clones potentially dangerous to the Empire was the 150 orders, also known as the Contingency Orders of the Grand Army of the Republic. Unlike normal orders, these were literally stamped into their brains via a biochip. The chip forced the clones to automatically follow these orders without question. The main purpose of this list of orders was Order 66, the execution of all Jedi as a result of treason against the Republic. But in order to make Order 66 less suspicious, there were 149 more decrees that followed a wide range of political and military scenarios. At least two of these orders, 5 and 65, dealt with the removal of Chancellor Palpatine. The power to issue these orders also fell outside of the executive branch and into the existing military power structure and Senate. These orders made the clones extremely dangerous. A case could easily be built against the Emperor and deem him unfit for leadership. And at the time, the Senate was still intact and there were still Republic loyalists plotting against him. And as Clones 5s and Rex eventually found out, these chips couldn't be switched off remotely by some universal switch. They had to be taken out one by one, which was very hard to do. Of course, this didn't mean that some clones didn't remove their inhibitor chips. Once the inhibitor chips were removed, the clones, despite their genetic engineering, displayed more independence and were even known to go AWOL and actively fight against the Empire. There was always the danger of more clones removing their chips and then telling their brothers in arms about the chips. This could potentially cause a large amount of clones to leave the Empire and even join an insurgency, which would be then full of trained professional killers. Many clones saw these inhibitor chips as a betrayal against them and a disregard for their rights as living beings. A lot of these clones might still be aligned with the Republic or even the Jedi Order. Along with clones removing their chips, some clones had their chips malfunction. One incident involved Clone Trooper Tup. His accident happened in the middle of a firefight and resulted in him shooting a Jedi General in the back. It's unknown what made the chip malfunction. It seems like prior to his incident, nothing like this had ever happened, but it does make the clones highly unpredictable. What if the same type of situation happened to an honor guard who was tasked with protecting Emperor Palpatine? What if Order 65 triggered him to shoot the Emperor? Essentially, the contingency order of the Grand Army of the Republic were not that different from subconscious reprogramming you might see in a spy novel. And again, because of how these orders were installed into the minds of clones, it was very hard to remove them. Another limiting factor of the clones was the fact that they had to be grown. Normally it took 9 years to grow and train a clone to a combat-ready state. This was a huge time investment for the Empire. This also meant that the Empire had to plan a decade ahead how many soldiers they would need. If there was suddenly a war in 5 years, there might be a clone shortage and not enough time to grow an army. And if that war ends prematurely, all those extra clones that they have grown will now be useless and have nothing to do, putting a further strain on the economy. This made for a dangerous situation strategically speaking. Without the ability to call up reserves or levy conscripts, huge losses after one battle could significantly cause a gap in manpower. Unlike civilian reserves, which were still able to contribute to society, there was no such thing as clone reserves. The only thing they really could do was just fight. In Legends, the Republic realized this danger and started experimenting with other cloning facilities. While the Kaminoans weren't known for creating the best quality clones, the process simply took too long. The Republic created the Spartite clones, which were a decent alternative to the Kaminoan clones. They had a much faster development cycle and it only took a few years to train and grow them, although they were definitely inferior to the Kaminoan clones. The problem with the Kaminoan clones was the fact that they aged much quicker than the average human being. This is how within 9 years they were able to raise a clone to full adulthood. But by the time they were 20 years old, they already had the physical body of a 40-year-old, which really shortened their combat lifespan. The clone troopers were also extremely expensive to produce. With a normal human soldier, society and individual families help raise them to adulthood. It's only when they become adults and join the service that the government provides anything for them. And then when these soldiers finish their service, they can expect some benefits and rewards for their sacrifice. With clones, they must be raised by the government from birth all the way to adulthood. So instead of housing and training the soldiers for a short period of time, the Republic had to pay for the clones' growth for 9 years before they actually were able to fight. This is a long-term investment, something a parent would normally do, but instead now the government has taken on this burden. And once these clones do retire, I mean, the government kind of has to take care of them because they don't really have a family that can watch over them. They don't have any marketable skills besides killing people that will allow them to find jobs, and no one really wants a few million ex-soldiers just sitting in the street without anything to do. I can imagine very quickly a lot of criminal cartels being interested in hiring these guys as armed thugs. The high cost and production time of clone troopers didn't really fit into the Empire's overall strategy. After the fall of the Republican Separatist Force, the Emperor was tasked with policing the galaxy. The Empire was made up of a vast amount of territory, millions of stars and planetary bodies, and the enemies of the Empire after the last Separatist holdouts were destroyed were relatively unorganized and lightly armed insurgency groups. The Empire didn't necessarily need the best soldiers to police these areas. They needed quantity over quality. The clone troopers were kind of overkill for this role. They were designed for large set-piece battles and intense high-energy combat. They weren't designed for policing civilian populaces and going on anti-piracy patrols. And a lot of what the Stormtroopers had to deal with on a daily basis was more trivial. They had to interact with local leaders, merchants, and petty criminals. Their job required more nuance and an understanding of human behavior and society. The clone troopers were only 13 by the time of the rise of the New Order. They didn't really have the life skills or street smarts to deal with ordinary citizens, let alone police them. While clones were generally less predictable and more individualistic than droids, they still shared the same genetic blueprints, similar personality traits, and the same training. This made them, in a way, easier to predict. Captain Rex was even able to create an algorithm that was able to predict how clones would behave in a variety of combat situations. When that information fell into the wrong hands, it was used very effectively against the clones and made them a liability on the battlefield. Well guys, that's our 10 reasons why clone troopers were phased out during the rise of the New Order. I am curious to see if there's any new canon content that comes out, whether it's in a comic book form or a novel, which will, delve deeper into this transition. They definitely do this more in Legends, in the Republic Commando series, which I love. Because I am curious about the other side of the argument as well, and that's why clone troopers actually would have made better soldiers than the Stormtroopers that replaced them. And we're going to be talking about that in our next video. We're going to give you 10 reasons why the clone troopers could have saved the Empire. So don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on that episode. And, thanks for joining us. As usual, if you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.